Hey, Brain Retrainers, Ben Aarons here, co-founder of Reorigin, where we teach you how to retrain your brain to reclaim your health. And in today's video, we're going to talk about something that is exceptionally common. More than 15% of adults have social anxiety disorder, and probably much more than that have experienced social anxiety at some point. So if you're new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe, keep apprised of the latest videos like this. And in this video, we're gonna dive deep into what causes social anxiety and most importantly, how you can use some quick and easy brain retraining techniques to reset your system and learn to remain calm by default in any given set of social or other circumstances. So you're going to want to stick around to the end of this video because I'm going to give you 3 techniques that you can actually start to practice right away. And of course, if at any time you want more info, you want to go deeper into brain retraining and learn more about how it works, what it can be applied to if you're struggling with social anxiety or another chronic condition like chronic fatigue, you can check out our website at re-origin.com, where we have a science-based brain retraining program that walks you through in 28 days all of the ins and outs of how you can apply these pretty extraordinary techniques to achieve some results that will lead you to feel like yourself again, or really like your whole natural self would feel, unencumbered by a lot of this wiring that sort of gets piled on as life happens. So without further ado, let's get into first a little bit, what is social anxiety? What does it feel like? What is my experience with it? And most importantly, how can we start to phase shift out of it? Well, like I said, more than 12 to 15% of adults have experienced actual social anxiety disorder. I would estimate far more than that have experienced some level of social anxiety, whether it's during confrontations, during meetings, out to dinner with families. We're at the holiday time around the time I'm recording this video, so I'm sure many people, this subject is top of mind. So essentially, in the Reorigin program, and one of the things that we talk about on this channel is this idea of a total stress load that can build up in the nervous system, something that's known as the allostatic load. Now, the allostatic load is being talked about more and more in neuroscience and health circles because when this total level of stress builds up through all sorts of different means, can be due to psychological stress, but also physical stress, also things like not sleeping, environmental conditions. All of these things can build up and effectively create a sort of short fuse type of effect where we feel like we don't really have the necessary resources to properly handle ourselves or handle certain situations. So you can just imagine if you've gone through a few nights even of poor sleep, we might feel a little bit more on edge, a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more susceptible to anything in the environment. And what can happen is because the brain's first order of business is to protect you, it oftentimes will use that short fuse to kind of go into overprotection mode. And when this happens, when we're in, say, a social circumstance, then the brain can start to register all of this, what it sort of sees as excess input, excess information coming at us from other people, from the environment. It can start to register that as a potential threat. Now, obviously, these people inherently, if it's friends and family members especially, there's nothing inherently threatening about them. However, if the brain is already feeling a little bit scarce of resources, and then we find ourselves in social situations or even a confrontation or conversation where we might perceive that there's a certain amount of demand on us for which we can't necessarily meet that demand, then we might find ourselves in a state of anxiety. Now, again, this is totally normal. If this is something you've experienced, normally and typically it passes after you've had a few good night's sleeps, things come back to baseline. But for many of us, if this is something that becomes a habit or something that we experience more frequently over time, then the brain can effectively learn to associate certain situations, like social situations, with that experience of anxiety. So with the physiology of an elevated heart rate, maybe sweaty palms, deep breathing, and so forth. Because remember, neurons that fire together wire together. The brain's first order of business is to protect you, to keep you safe. Its second order of business is efficiency. It's to learn from the past to protect us in the future. And it does this by creating these neural pathways that may serve a function at one time, but when it comes to an ongoing stress response associated with social activity, then that same type of response is no longer warranted. So, fortunately, the same way that your brain learns to overprotect you in these times of excess stress, we can also consciously teach it or retrain it to default to a different response. The flip side to that Donald Hebb quote of neurons that fire together wire together is neurons that fire apart wire apart. And so the more we practice a different response with respect to the triggering or challenging situation, this can actually create a new default in the system. So, how do we do this? Okay, let's just say for the sake of this example that it's large social gatherings or dinner with a large group of people that might trigger that felt sense of anxiety. Well, the first thing we want to do is try and just identify what it is. So in this case, we kind of have maybe a picture of it. Maybe there's a memory of it that comes to mind. Now, from there, one of the first techniques we can use is something that's used even to this day by Olympic athletes, is mental rehearsal, meaning we can basically not put ourselves in that situation yet, but we can actually imagine ourselves in that situation. And at the same time, we can practice regulating our nervous system to create a different association, neurons that fire together and wire together in a different pattern than the way that they did before. So one of the things that we talk about at Reorigin is the importance of what's known as gradual exposure or systematic desensitization. Rather than just throwing ourselves into the deep end of the pool and going to the middle of Times Square and trying to practice there, we want to try and practice in an environment where we can control the variables. And what better environment than one that you can tap into with your own mind. Now, for some people, visualization and immersion can be a little bit more challenging, not a problem. You can also use real world stimuli to create that felt sense. So you can, for instance, look at a video of being at dinner with someone on YouTube, for instance, or just Google an image of a dinner, anything that kind of brings up that sensation for you. Now, the key is when we do this, we want to start off by really creating a large distance between the object that's creating the anxious situation and ourselves. So let's say whether it's in your mind's eye or you have a picture in front of you of this social scene that would ordinarily produce some level of anxiety, you might start off with that picture being across the room from you. Meanwhile, you are sitting over here or standing over here and just taking some deep breaths, shaking out your limbs, maybe doing some neck rolls. We have a bunch of videos on this channel and more coming down the pike on things that you can do to calm the nervous system. So any of these techniques, deep breathing, progressive relaxation, exhaling, smiling, all of these can help you shift your physiology, even giving yourself a hug to let your system know that you are safe, resourced, and supported. And we're doing that in the presence of the thing, even though it's maybe at a distance, in the presence of the thing that is challenging you. Now, the next step might be maybe you bring that image a little bit closer. Maybe if it's in your mind's eye, you imagine that you're sort of approaching that table with all of the people that are there. And again, you take a few minutes and you go back to your deep breathing, hugging yourself, relaxation, and reminding yourself that you are in fact resourced in this moment. And third, you would even go a bit closer, closing the gap, imagining yourself sitting down at that table among those people and still practicing the same self-regulation techniques. What you're doing here is actually really powerful. You are telling your brain to create a new association, a relaxation response in reference to that same situation that previously caused a challenge response or a threat response, as it might be. So of course, you can see how you can gradually work your way up practicing this even maybe a few times a day until eventually, when the time comes to actually be in that situation, you now have the tools. And at first you might find that you still have to use those tools in real time, right? So maybe you're in that social circumstance and you have to still take some deep breaths. And the next two tips will get into what to do when you're actually in game time, in real time. But eventually what does happen is your brain learns the new message and actually defaults to that new state of calm without you having to consciously implement these techniques. So the first one is gradual exposure, imagining yourself or using a visual to gradually close the gap between you and the challenging situation. Number two is in real time, when you're in those situations, you can use a technique or something called two-pointed awareness. Now, our brain has this really cool and unique ability to actually focus on multiple inputs. If you think about it right now, just think about your vision. You have your narrow focus of vision, maybe you're looking at this screen, but you also have peripheral vision, right? You can actually see to some degree what's happening on the sides of you, maybe even out to the walls of the room that you're in. Now, typically we don't really pay attention to the peripheral vision, which makes sense because we want to keep our focus on what's happening and what our brain deems is most. However, if you relax your body and if you relax your gaze, you can actually become more aware of what's going on in the periphery. And this can actually have an interesting and calming effect. There's been some interesting research here on what's known as something called the cathedral effect. Huberman talks about this on his podcast as well. But when we give ourselves that sense of space, when we practice soft gazing and we pay attention to what's going on in the periphery, it can actually create this felt sense of relaxation in the nervous system. So how do you apply this? Let's say again, in that social circumstance where you feel yourself maybe becoming a little bit anxious, or let's say maybe you're even in a meeting or on a call and you're having to bring your full focus to something that's a little bit challenging. You can absolutely maintain your focus there while at the same time using this two-pointed awareness to shift some amount of your attention to what's happening in the environment. So one way that I like to do this is through a felt sense, through using my actual senses. So maybe I will just plant my feet firmly on the floor as I'm doing right now. Maybe I'll actually turn my attention a little bit toward feeling how my bottom feels when I'm sitting on this seat, feeling how supported I am with my feet on the ground and my butt in the chair. Maybe I'll even have, an object or something on my desk that has a certain weight to it. Like I just saw, I can pick up this pen and I can hold this in my hand and I can just feel the weight of this pen. So now, as I'm talking, as I'm making this video, most of my attention is in fact going toward you, toward the camera and toward what I'm saying, but some degree, let's call it 10 or 15% of my awareness is now grounded in the physical world, holding on to this object. I can feel my feet on the floor. I can feel my bottom and myself supported by the chair that I'm sitting in. And this produces a very strong and vivid sense that I am supported. I am resourced here. And so, where previously I might have been intimidated or overwhelmed or starting to feel anxious by whatever's going on here, now I might still feel those things, but they're really not impacting me so much because I'm also feeling how grounded I am in my environment. So if technique one is gradual exposure using mental rehearsal or some visual stimuli, technique two is using two-pointed awareness in real time to ground yourself into the environment using your senses while at the same time remaining present with the situation at hand. This takes practice, and one of the ways that I recommend practicing this is just take a moment now, even on this video, to, as you're listening to the rest of this video, see if you can pay some degree of attention to what's happening in your body and in the environment as well. Okay, moving on to the third and final technique I'll share here. And this again is when you're in real time. It might seem a little bit obvious, but we definitely forget to do it. And this one is taking breaks. If you're in a social situation or even a meeting to some degree and you find yourself feeling anxious, one of the things that we sometimes forget we have the option to do is just simply excuse ourselves, right? This can be excusing ourselves to go to the restroom, just going outside to get a breath of fresh air. It doesn't really matter what the reason is that we give, but anything that we can do to sometimes just get up, change our environment, have a little session with ourselves where we can take a few deep breaths and reset back to neutral. Then we can come back into the situation feeling resourced. We might also remind ourselves of these techniques that we can then practice there. So I've been in situations where when I was recovering from chronic Lyme and I was sensitive to everything and I had tremendous anxiety and social anxiety, I remember multiple times at dinners I would just excuse myself to the restroom. Didn't need to let anyone know what was happening, but I just would excuse myself, gotta go use the restroom, and I would just take a moment, put a smile on my face, practice some breathing techniques, and come back feeling slightly more energized, grounded, and in control. So try these out. Let me know how this works for you. If you were able to maintain this two-pointed awareness, or if it already went out of your mind. If it did, no worries. This is a new skill. And one of the cool things about brain retraining and how we approach it at Reorigin is just like any skill, it really can be acquired and conditioned over time. The thing that I most like and what most intrigues me about these brain retraining type of techniques is not only are they so potent and powerful for using in real time, but the more we practice them with consistency, the more it leads to becoming your new default state. And we've had So many people in our program go through it and say that they feel completely different, or more to the point, that they feel like their true selves, that what they've finally experienced now is that what they've been responding to, or the way they've been reacting, is actually not them. It's just their old wiring and old chemistry. When we start to realize that, we can let ourselves off the hook, realizing that however you're feeling, anxious, tired, wired, whatever it might be, it's okay. It's not you. It's simply the function of a slightly outdated brain that's simply in need of a new update. And you can be the one to give it that update. So give these techniques a try. If you want to go deeper into brain retraining, check out re-origin.com, and I will look forward to seeing you in a future video.